Okie dokie. So in the previous lecture, we talked about evolution and the 5 methods of that, which you will see in this slide. So just as a brief summary, evolution can happen 5 different ways. I just put up 4 fingers, but I meant to put up 5. 5 different ways. So natural selection. So that is kind of the survival of the fittest, or just like, things are surviving more in certain environments than others. Then you have genetic mutations, then those can happen just completely randomly. A lot of mutations happen and they don't do anything at all. And some mutations are beneficial and some mutations are much, much worse. You also have gene flow, and that is just when organisms of the same species come into a population. So maybe when you have multiple herds of wildebeest and they all come together and join into a big herd during migration, that would be an example of gene flow. You also have genetic drift, and that is when things just change gradually throughout time. So we talked about the COVID example and how the population in the world today is different than the population before because of people dying and different immune systems and stuff. And then we have non-random mating. And of course, that was when we talked about the peacocks. And the reason why there's these huge feathers is because the peahens find it very sexy, very, very sexy indeed. So that's the 5 ways that evolution occurs. And today we're going to talk about species specifically. And what exactly does that even mean? Because when we talk about evolution, we talk about new species coming up, some species dying off and all that. But what does this even mean? So we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about some evidence that we have for evolution. So we've talked about the history of evolution and how it happens. And today we're going to get into kind of a little bit more specificity. So species, what does that mean? The most common definition of species that's given is what we call the biological species definition. Yes. That is where you have 2 individuals that can mate and reproduce and their young are viable, then they are the same species. Otherwise, they are not. And by viable, I mean that they can have babies. So one example of this would be a lion and a tiger. They're considered 2 different species. They can mate. They can have a liger. Yes, a liger is a real animal. They don't normally happen in the wild. They just happen in zoos, but that's how we found out they can mate. But ligers are almost always infertile. So that's why lions and tigers are still considered 2 different species. Now, this is also what we consider like donkeys and horses breeding and making mules. Mules are almost always infertile, so you may be like a little bit of a closer to home definition. So that is the most commonly given definition of species. And I use that term because, to be completely honest, there are literally hundreds of definitions of species. And you might be like, no way. Yes. And this just kind of goes to show that when we talk about science, people think about it as very black and white, and it's just not. And that's because these organisms, lions and tigers, they don't care if you consider them the same species or not. They truly don't. It's not going to change their behavior at all. This is one of the things that we do in science is we try to put the world and biology and life into a box, but it doesn't really fit. And so even with ligers, there are a couple, not very often, but occasionally they can produce fertile offspring. Just like occasionally mules can reproduce, normally not. So this definition is the one that's most commonly given, but it's not the only definition by any means. Another definition that's pretty commonly used, and being an ecologist happens to be my favorite, but you can do you, is what we call the ecological species definition. And this has to do with where organisms actually live. So we have the American robin. And we have those all over Oklahoma. You've seen them. They're brown birds with a big red chest. They eat worms and things. The early bird gets the worm. That's a robin for you. So the thing about the American robin is that they are found all over North America. Literally. So this is their home range. The purple that you see is where they live all the time. The red is where they go sometimes, and they breed, and the blue is where they go sometimes, but they don't breed there. And then we have vagrants. I love that term. That is a biological term, and pretty much that means they just kind of showed up there. They should not supposed to be there. They're the vagrants, which I just think is hilarious. So the thing about the ecological species definition is, by the biological species definition, this is one species. They all live in the same, or they all can reproduce and produce viable young. But here's the dealio. realistically, the robins that live up here, they stay up here. The robins that live down here, or let's even, let's go to oops, that's not where we live. We live right here. Let's pretend like I put the star in the right spot the first time. So over here in Alva, our Alva robins, they're probably never going to meet these Alaskan robins. So even though they could reproduce, do they actually? No. So by the ecological species definition, they wouldn't be considered the same species, because even though that they could, they don't. And this happens a lot of times. There are organisms that when we bring them together, like in a zoo, we find out they can breed. But in real life, in the world, they live on totally different continents. So they would never actually come into contact with each other. And so they have what we call reproductive isolation. That's here. They also have this divergent selection. What that means is they have different selective pressures. So that sounds fancy. What I'm really trying to say is the robins in Alaska, they want to stay warm. It is cold. Alaska snows. It's icy. It's freezing. It gets dark for weeks. The robins here in Alva, they need to be able to withstand cold. It gets cold some, but also it gets freaking hot. Like a bazillion and 8 degrees. I'm pretty sure that's what the thermometer said last summer. So they have to survive very, very different environments. So robins that can survive in warmer environments are just going to do better in Alva than they will do in Alaska. And that doesn't mean that they're different species necessarily, but it means that they have different selective pressures. So what allows them to survive better is different because their range is so big. So again, this is another definition of species, but to be honest, animals don't care. And a good example of this, and kind of like, I don't know, a big like middle finger to scientists, I feel, are hybrids. So hybrids are animals that are considered different species, but they can reproduce and create viable young. So by no definition should they really be considered different, but we still call them different. Why? I don't know. Probably because it just takes a long time to like update it. And maybe it's because historically, so the example I'm giving you are crayfish. If you don't know, this is what I studied for my PhD, yes. So this crayfish right here is called a rusty crayfish. It's called that because it's got this big red dot right here on its side, a rust spot, if you will. Now this crayfish over here is called the virile crayfish. They are the same genus, but different species. However, the rusty crayfish is incredibly invasive and is moving farther and farther up north, and now lives in areas where virile crayfish live. And in those areas, they create what we call hybrids. So they're where one parent is virile, one parent's rusty, they reproduce, they create a hybrid. These hybrids can also reproduce and have babies. So really, are they different species? No, but we still consider them this. Hybrids are the result of 2 species reproducing, and they're really, really common in nature, especially among inverts like insects and things. The arthropods, they're just all reproducing. If something's around, they're going to do it. And so again, I'm not using these examples to make you more confused, which I'm afraid might be the result, but that's never the goal. The goal is just to show you that like biology doesn't care. Ecology doesn't care. It doesn't matter if we consider them the same species or not. They just are, So I just wanted to like use that caveat, because when we talk about evolution, sometimes it kind of seems pedantic. Like, these 2 species have changed slightly, so now we're evolving. Yes and no. You could argue that this hybridization is evolution. I would. These 2 species used to be completely isolated. Now they're together and they're making new species. But this definition of species is really minor. And because of that, things are changing all the time. And what is considered a species is always changing slightly. And that's really where evolution is. Yes, over millions and millions of years, you get the difference between bonobos and humans that we have. But every day we're changing little bits, and we don't consider, we're a brand new species now, but we're still changing. And that's really important to realize, that evolution is a very slow process over many, many, many generations. And also it's happening all the time, including today. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end when we give you some of your evidence. Now, The act of creating new species is called speciation. And again, this is a very slow process and there's not like a clear cutoff. Now, speciation can happen two ways usually. You have allopatric speciation, and all that means is that there is a barrier. Usually this is a physical barrier, but it can be a temporal barrier too. So here in this example, you have these beetles, they're brown. Now, over time, maybe it's a huge rainy season and there are floods. And when there's enough rain, you can create rivers. That's how we get rivers. And maybe this river stays around for a few years. Well, it cut that beetle population in half. We used to have them all reproducing, but now they don't. Well, over time, if that river lasts enough generations, so let's say that river lasts a couple hundred years, that's not unheard of at all. Then what's going on here is that this top population is undergoing evolution completely differently than this bottom population. Maybe there was a mutation that started turning these beetles green. Maybe on north side of the river, it's a very green environment versus on the south side, it's very dusty. And so being light brown is better, whereas being on the top, being green is better. We don't know. It could just be random. It could be, more beneficial. But what the important part is that it's changing differently because of this barrier. And then even if that barrier goes away, so even if they have a drought and the river dries up, if they come back together, now you have two different species. These green beetles and these brown beetles might not be able to reproduce. They might, sometimes they can, sometimes they don't change that much and they can reproduce and, then we don't consider it different species. Sometimes they still change a lot, but they can still reproduce again. This is where that hybrids kind of come in. What is the definition of a species? Who knows? Honestly, who knows? And this happens a lot. And like I said, this can happen because of a physical barrier. It can also happen because of a temporal barrier. Maybe one group starts to be more active during the day and another becomes more and more active at night. And so they won't reproduce because one's diurnal and one's nocturnal. This did happen with the Mexican spotted owl and the northern spotted owl. So anybody know what's going on right here? What's this? We have that mountain range called the Rockies, And so what happened is some owls went over the mountain range and ended up here on the west coast of the United States. Most of them did not. Most of them stayed down where they normally are. The Mexican spotted owl was the original species. And so they're kind of found in south United States, kind of southwest, I guess, and down into Mexico. A few of those species, like individuals, again, went over the Rocky Mountains and now are living on the West Coast. And because they're on the West Coast, now they have a completely different climate. The West Coast is very, very wet. Portland and Washington, it rains all the time. If you've ever seen Twilight, Forks, Washington, always rainy. Versus down here in the Southwest, it's typically very, very dry. So these birds had very different environments in which they lived in. And after being separated for, hundreds of years and many generations, now they're considered completely different species. If they came back together, could they reproduce? I'm not sure. I don't think we've ever done that. But because they live such different lives and have such different environments they survive in, they're considered different species. And again, that barrier is the Rockies. So that means that you don't have to have one come up out of nowhere like this river. It can already be there and it just creates a barrier. They get over it one way kind of on accident maybe, or maybe they're introduced and then they can't get back. You can also have speciation that occurs without a barrier. And this is what we call sympatric speciation. So there's absolutely no barrier here. They just evolve differently in the same environment. So what happens here, and this is an example of fish in Central America, Nicaragua specifically. I feel like I said that really weird, but it's fine. And what happens is you have this big lake. Oh, I did not mean to make this a diamond, but here we are. We're going to go with it. You have this big lake, Lake Nicaragua. And through river systems, it is attached to Lake Managua And when it's flooding, it's also attacked these other little lakes over here. So you have your original species, this citronellus fish, and it's benthic. And benthic means that it lives on the bottom of water bodies. So it could live on the bottom of a lake, on the bottom of the ocean, on the bottom of a river, whatever, just near the bottom. Think of like a catfish or a flounder living on the bottom. Versus limnetic means it lives higher in the water column. So this would be things like tuna or jack that live, within the water body, not near the bottom. A lot of sharks. And so when it floods or when there's lots of water, this citronellus fish could kind of get up into Lake Managua and Lake Apoyo and, all over the place. And what happened is that species of fish, when it was over there, first of all, there was some allopatric speciation because there was a barrier. When it wasn't flooded, they couldn't go back to the main lakes. But then there was also sympatric speciation. So there is these fish, but these lakes that they live in now are really, really tiny. So kind of like we talked about with Darwin's finches, if they all stayed the exact same, they all were benthic fish, they would outcompete each other and kill each other off. So what happened is what we call, this fancy term, called niche partitioning. And this is what happened with Darwin's finches too. Pretty much they occupy different niches so that they don't compete with each other. So some of these fish continued to be benthic, and some started to live farther and farther up in the water. As you go farther and farther up in the water, you eat completely different things. Your body shape completely changes. As you can see here, especially at Lake Apoyo, you can see the body shapes of these two fish are very different. The coloration of the fish are quite different. And so what happens is that even though there's no physical barrier, there's nothing that's like stopping them from going up and down the water column, they just kind of change, and some stay up more and some stay down more. And again, when we talk about evolution, we have to remember this happens over many, many, many generations. This isn't like some go up, some go down, the next day they're different species. This is over many, many, many different generations. And so there's no barrier, but they still become different species. And when this happens really fast, well, you have maybe a founder species like these fish, or here, these are birds in Hawaii. This is really similar to Darwin's finches. When you get species evolution that happens really fast, we call it radiation. And so what happens is you go from one species to many different species relatively quickly. And by that, I mean, it may take a couple thousand instead of, tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So this actually happened on Hawaiian Islands. There was a couple of birds that flew over to the islands. And from those founder species, which we talked about founder species last time, that's when you're the first of your species, evolution happened, and there became lots and lots of different species that, again, occupied really different niches. And you can tell that by their beak shape, just like we talked about with Darwin's finches. This bird with this really long skinny beak actually eats flowers like that have really long throats. It's kind of like occupies the niche of a hummingbird. This bird with this really big beak eats nuts, and so does this one. This bird eats insects. And so you can see there's all these different beak shapes which allow them to eat and consume many, many, many different things. And because this happened from one species going into many different species fast, we call it species radiation. And that's pretty common, especially on islands. Now, another thing that can happen on islands, but it's not just an island thing, is when you get what's called an endemic species. And endemic species are kind of groups of animals that only live in one specific location. Usually it's not just one species, it's kind of a group. The best example of this is Madagascar. Madagascar is a relatively large island off the east coast of Africa. And Madagascar is really interesting because it's an island that doesn't have really any big prey. Or predators, I'm sorry. There's no big cats. It's the only place with no big cats. And so that allowed for a lot of different organisms to evolve, like lemurs. And I believe there are 13 different species of lemurs. I always forget the number. Number of species of lemurs. Oops, misspelled lemur. 32, not 13. There are 32 different species of lemurs. That's incredible. That's so many. And all species of lemur live off the coast of Madagascar. I mean, in Madagascar. There are no lemurs anywhere else. So lemurs, that whole group, all 32 species, are considered endemic to Madagascar. A lot of things like kangaroos are endemic to Australia. Sorry, completely forgot. There's no kangaroos found anywhere else in the world, even though there's multiple species of kangaroo and wallaby. This can also happen. It doesn't have to be an island. A lot of times it is, because once it's an island, there can be different evolution. But this can also happen like in the middle of a rainforest. There can be, organisms that live in that rainforest that don't live anywhere else because they kind of are isolated. So usually it has like a habitat that's isolated from anything else, and organisms evolve there. And so they become endemic, like these lemur. Now, evolution sometimes can look really crazy. And it looks like you have the exact same organism, but they're not, and they're in really different areas. So we have this example of parallel evolution. So in parallel evolution, they have a relatively close ancestor, but they have evolved into different species that have a similar niche. So placentals versus marsupials, we talked about this when we talked about mammals. Placentals have a placenta and get nourishment as they grow, whereas marsupials, they deliver really, really underdeveloped young, and then they come up and live in a pouch for a really long time until they grow up. So placentas and marsupials are both mammals, so they have a relatively recent ancestor, but over time they've evolved, but they kind of evolved really similarly. So you have two different squirrels that both can fly. Well, this is a phalanger versus a squirrel, but they both have that really gliding body shape, just like a flying squirrel. They're not the same species, and they're not even like one, they've been separated by a pretty long time, not a ridiculous, they're both mammals, but a pretty long time. Similarly, you have two different types of anteaters. One is a marsupial, one is a placenta. Anteaters have those really long noses that allows them to eat termites and stuff. Usually really long, sticky tongues. They also have pretty big claws, so they can like tear down the mounds that these insects build. But they're not the same species. They just occupy a similar niche. They do similar things in the environment. And so this can happen when they have relatively close ancestors. But we also have this example of convergent evolution, which is where they don't necessarily occupy the same niche, but they look similar. So organisms that look similar, even though they have not been related for a really long time. So we have eels. Eels are fish. But eels look really similar to what animal? Snakes. So eels and snakes, fish versus reptiles, they diverged millions of years ago. But over time, they have kind of what we call converged. So they kind of ended up with this similar body shape, this long, slender form, which allows them to kind of go in and out of really small environments really easy. A lot of snakes kind of live in brush or even in trees. And so they can go into really dynamic habitats that have all sorts of crazy things going on without, getting snagged on things. Similarly, a lot of eels live in coral reefs, which are really, really complex. So we have this convergent evolution. Now, evolution is also really, really impacted by humans. And this is one of the examples of evolution. It kind of slightly goes into my evidence for evolution, is that we've seen evolution happen now. And remember, evolution, by definition, is just a change in genes over time. It doesn't necessarily have to end up with different species. It can or it doesn't. Now, an example of this that's human mediated, so humans completely altered it, is the peppered moth. So the peppered moth is from the UK, and in the UK there's a lot of ash trees. And because of this peppering on its wings, they have really good camouflage. Now you can probably tell, oops, let me draw it actually. Here is the peppered moth, but it's got really good camouflage. It's pretty hard to see. Well, right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, we burned a lot of coal. And by burning a bunch of coal, the soot and ash got all over the trees. By getting all over the trees, it literally turned the trees black. So our beautiful peppered moths with that amazing natural camouflage, they now stick out like a sore thumb. So birds that eat these moths are like, well, there you go. There's my moth. I'm going to eat it. Now, naturally, and this happens with a lot of insects, there was another morph. There were some black peppered moths. Most of them had this white and black spottedness, but some of them were pretty much all black. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, these black morphs didn't survive very well. They survived enough that they stayed in the population, you know, they didn't completely die out, but they didn't survive super well. Well, after the Industrial Revolution, when all the trees turned black, now they have the good camouflage. So before, now these are kind of broad numbers, these aren't exact, but you get the gist. Before the Industrial Revolution, about 95% of the peppered moths were white and 5% were black. After the Industrial Revolution, about 90% of the peppered moths were black and 10% were white. That's because, again, the trees changed. They got that soot all over it, and so the environment changed. And so the genes in the peppered moth population are completely different before and after. It doesn't mean that they're a new species, because they're not, but the genes are different, and so that's evolution. And the other thing that's about evolution, like I said, is it's always happening all the time. As we don't burn as much coal now, we still burn fossil fuels and stuff, but we don't burn as much coal. And so we don't have as much soot. So it could be that over time, the trees start to lose that soot and ash and they become more white, and then the white peppered moths will work again. And this creates what we call the Red Queen hypothesis. This is named after Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Or, well, sorry, the book is called Through the Looking Glass. And there's the Red Queen, which, you know, in the Disney version is the Queen of Hearts. And there's this famous quote, the Red Queen has to run faster and faster in order to keep still where she is. And so what that means is that she's going and going and going, but she's not actually progressing. And this happens a lot with evolution. When we talk about, you know, evolution and how it's happening all the time, predators and prey are a great example of this. You know, a prey might get a little bit faster, but then its predator gets just a little bit faster too to keep up. We don't have prey that have no predators, or predators that kill off all of their prey, because then they would die. So we always have animals that are evolving a little bit, but then their predator will evolve a little bit too. And this is how they keep up. So even though you're changing, everything is changing. Another example besides predator and prey, where you see this in evolution, is parasites. So you have this really cute little puppy, and like a lot of puppies, it's full of parasites. So this is a roundworm. Really commonly found in puppies. It's transmitted through poop, and, you know, dogs like to eat poop, especially puppies, or they might live around, you know, if there's lots of animals around, they just might be surrounded by poop and things like that. So we see this a lot in parasites, where puppies, you know, can get dewormer and stuff, and it kills all the parasites. But then we end up getting a species, you know, a mutation, and the parasite becomes a lot more, becomes immune to that. Kind of like we talked about with antibiotic resistance. So that dewormer doesn't work anymore. And not all of them become immune immediately, just a couple do. But those couples survive. And so now that dewormer doesn't work anymore, you got to get a new one. This happens a lot with flea and tick medicine. So fleas become immune to things. So things like, if you know, have dogs or cats, you know, Frontline came out, but now you can't even get normal Frontline. You get Frontline Plus or Frontline HeartGuard or things like that. It changes because the original stuff doesn't even affect fleas anymore, because so many fleas are immune to it. just like we talked about with antibiotic resistance, it's kind of the same thing. And that's why we call it the Red Queen hypothesis, because they can change, oh, we have a new flea medicine. It's going to kill all the fleas. Well, some of them are going to survive, and now they're strong. So that medicine is worthless. And then most of the fleas are going to become immune to it. So now we have to have a new medicine, back and forth like that. I hope that makes sense. This is really common in evolution. And again, I'm really only telling you this to show you that evolution is changing all the time. And it's ongoing. We don't like evolve and then stop. Humans are evolving, and I'll tell you some examples of that in a minute. Another example, and kind of again goes with evidence of evolution, is artificial selection. So what this means is that we can kind of manipulate things. I myself grew up with dachshunds or wiener dogs. They're great. They're absolutely amazing dogs. Like any other dog, they come from wolves. Wolves and wiener dogs look very different. Do you think wiener dogs would have naturally evolved? Probably not. But they were bred to have really short legs and be really ferocious, because they would go into badger holes in Germany and kill the badgers. And that's what they were bred to do. They're hunting dogs. Versus things like a Bichon Frise, those little white fluffy dogs, they were literally bred to sit down and to be lap dogs. People, especially royalty, wanted lap dogs. They wanted really cute little dogs that would just sit there and do nothing all day with them. Versus things like cattle dogs, which are really popular around here, they were bred to herd cattle. They're all the same species. So a breed is just like a subset of a species, which means all dogs can breed together. I have a Pomsky, a Pomeranian Husky. That probably wouldn't happen naturally because a Pomeranian is like, 5 pounds and a Husky is like 60. But I have a Pomsky. And we call this artificial selection because what that means is that this didn't happen naturally. Dachshunds didn't just occur naturally. Humans made that happen. Humans bred for dogs to have shorter and shorter legs. Humans bred for fluffier and fluffier dogs with less and less energy. You get the Bichon. Like I said, blue heelers have lots and lots of energy, and they're good at herding. And so by breeding these dogs specifically with goals in mind, we change the population and we change the genes. And by changing the genes, we made evolution happen. And we also do this with cows. We've done this with cats. We've done this with most of our domesticated animals. Racehorses are a good example. If a racehorse wins, I don't know, the Kentucky Derby, then its semen is worth a lot of money. And you want to keep that line alive, and you can get ridiculously priced horse semen because in theory it's a really, really good horse. But that's again artificially selecting. We're trying to keep these good genes in the gene pool. That's also sometimes can turn out kind of bad. Things like Dalmatians. Dalmatians, beautiful dog, really, really smart, tend to be really aggressive. And that's because those intelligent genes also happen to be associated with aggression. Also, golden retrievers, great dogs. They get really, really popular. People love them. 54% of all golden retrievers have cancer. That's because, kind of like we talked about with the monarchs, they're so inbred that their genes are kind of a mess. So we're changing all of those genetics, and it's not happening naturally. We're doing it. The golden doodle, the schnoodle, all of these like designer breeds. It's all because humans are doing that. And that's evolution. It's just instead of naturally occurring, humans are doing it. So that's part of our evidence too. We also, you may have seen this, when you have organisms as we develop, and we talked about this when we talked about chordates a little bit, but as organisms develop, early stages, we look pretty much the same. We have these pharyngeal pouches. Now, how long it takes to get from here to here is different. A chick, it takes a few weeks, versus a human, it takes 10 months. So we look really, really similar at the beginning, and then things change, and then, fish kind of diverged off, but still at this point, there's a lot of similarities here. And now at this point, you can tell the difference. The humans have lost their tail, but the turtles and the chickens look really similar, which isn't that surprising considering they're both reptiles. But this just goes to show that at the beginning, we all looked really similar. And we still do. I mean, this is what every single one of you at the beginning of your life looked like this. You look just like a fish. And so that's all conserved. We've all had that for millions and millions of years since pretty much the dawn of chordates. We have this, and even though we change a lot over that development, at the beginning, we're very similar. There's also this example of homologous structures. And what this means is that organisms have pretty much very, very similar structures that do the same thing, even though they're not the same organisms. So these are a bunch of mammals, and we all have the same bone structure in our arms. We have one big bone, that's the humerus. You got two bones that are right beside each other, the radius and ulna. The carpals are our wrist, the metacarpals are our hand, and then the phalanges. We see this in your cats and dogs. They have the same hand structure and bone structure. We see this in whales and bats. Even things like alligators have really similar structure, though it is a little bit different. So this is that even though we're different species, a lot of it internally is very similar. And the reason why it's very similar is because our ancestors, millions and millions of years ago, when mammals first started coming about, they developed this structure, it worked, and so it's still around. Now, another thing that is really interesting about evolution, and it's kind of evidence, and it's kind of also when people argue about evolution, they're like, yeah, but everything doesn't always, evolution just makes it sound like everything works out and the strongest survive and all that. And I hope I've kind of shown you that that's not true and that's not what evolution is. But there's also these ideas of spandrels, and that's that things evolve and there's not necessarily a benefit for them. And we know this happens. This term comes from architecture. So it used to be, probably like the 1700s, I think it was, arches were the big deal. And especially like if you look at old cathedrals and stuff, there's arches everywhere. And it's like, oh, we love a good arch. They're gorgeous. They're very aesthetically pleasing. But when you make an arch, you get these triangles when two arches come together. The triangle is not the goal. They just happen to be there because we can't have two arches without having these triangles. The triangles are called spandrels. They're not the goal, but they just happen. Spandrels also occur in evolution. They're not the goal, but they just kind of come up. And you might be like, that sounds like crap. The first spandrel has to do with snails and their shape. But humans all have spandrels too. And one spandrel that you're all pretty associated with is the chin. Humans have this jutting out chin. Our close chimps, bonobos, they don't have a chin. It's more flat. We have no idea why we have chins. As far as we can tell, there's no selective pressure. There's no benefit. They just kind of occurred and they didn't kill us, so they're still here. So chins are a spandrel. We all have them, but they don't do anything. And this just goes to show that not everything that happens in evolution gives you a benefit. It's not always survival of the fittest. It's not always, wow, we're getting better. We're so good. Sometimes things just pop up and they stay in our genes. Somebody at some point in time in human evolution had a chin, and that population was successful enough that now we all have chins. But it doesn't mean that it helped us with anything. There's also a ton of fossil evidence that kind of shows the progression of organisms. Now, it's not always perfect because fossils are, of course, kind of, I'm trying to think. They're impressions of the past. And a lot of times we have bones and things. Bones fossilize really, really well. Things like plants don't fossilize because they don't have bones. Teeth fossilize really well, but cartilage doesn't. That's why with sharks, the reason we know about megalodons and how big they are is because of their teeth. We don't have like a megalodon skeleton because they have cartilage, and cartilage doesn't fossilize. Now, sometimes we get impressions, and that's how we know about plants, and that's where usually it's in tars or pits or things where things kind of lay on and you can get like the impression of it. So like an imprint that's left behind, but you don't have the actual plant there. Like you have a fossil, a bone, but you can kind of see what happens. This is Archaeopteryx, and this is one of the best fossils we have, but this is an impression. And so an Archaeopteryx obviously maybe got crushed by a boulder or something and it died and it got smushed. But we have the impressions of its wings, its feathers, and all of its bones. And this is one of the earliest feathery reptiles. Because remember, birds are reptiles. And so what we think this is this was an artist rendition of what Archaeopteryx probably looked like, is that this was probably some of the first feathery reptiles. And as over time, it became more and more like birds that we think of today. You know, most birds don't have these little fingers like reptiles do, and Archaeopteryx did, though eventually those kind of died away. But this is kind of a stepping stone between like a raptor, like, you know, a velociraptor, and a bird. We also have evidence, this is Tiktaalik. This is evidence, we talked about how all life started in the water and then it came onto land. Tiktaalik is one of the fossils that kind of shows that progression. It has front flippers. It's not completely legs. So it seems like it could have maybe walked on land for a little bit. It has no back legs. So it wasn't a tetrapod. It couldn't like stand up and walk around like a lizard or things like that, but it kind of showed the progression. And we have a lot of fossils that, again, we don't have like every single thing because fossils don't always survive. Not everything fossilizes. But we can see, we have enough of records to kind of show, okay, here's the transition. We also have transitions kind of back. Whales, as you probably know, are mammals. So you're related to whales. Whales are not fish. And so there are whale ancestors that were completely terrestrial. They lived on land. But they started going into the water a little bit, assumedly for food. And then they lived in the water longer and longer. Again, probably because, you know, their food's in the water, so they're going to live in the water. They lived even longer. And then you have the first ancestral whales. They've pretty much completely lost their back legs. The way their head attaches to their shoulder, or their skull and their neck attaches is completely different, because whales, the way their neck comes in kind of near the top of their skull instead of at the bottom, like with humans. And that's so that they don't have to sit there and be looking up all the time. Because otherwise, if they're swimming, like if you think about you swimming, you're looking down. Well, that's not helpful for a whale. So instead, because it's looking up, its spinal column actually inserts higher in its skull so that it's more streamlined. Its front paws have become more and more flipper-like, and its tail has become much, much bigger. And again, we have fossils of all of these that kind of show that transition from a mammal that was terrestrial and has moved to become aquatic, like the whale. There's also vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are structures that modern day have no point at all. Whales still have hip bones. You have to have hip bones if you're a tetrapod, which means you have 4 legs. The hips kind of give your body support. That's why humans have hips. They support our body. Whales don't need hip bones because they don't have back legs. But they still have really, really rudimentary ones that don't have any purpose. They seem to just be left over from before. Snakes also have this. Snakes used to have legs. Now they don't. They evolved really, really quickly. And there's still questions about how we have so many species of snakes so fast. But they lost their legs really fast. But some of them still have these vestigial structures called spurs. It's near the back. And some males use them to clasp onto females. So they have a little bit of a purpose, but some of them don't. They kind of just seem to be left over from when they used to have legs. Now they don't have legs, but they still have little, like, I think of them as little nubbins. And like I said, evolution is happening all the time, even with humans. An example of this is our wisdom teeth. So humans evolved wisdom teeth because our ancestors ate a lot more plant matter. And by having a lot more plant matter, you had to chew a lot more. And you had to break down your food a lot more. They also didn't have things like knives to cut up. Well, we've had utensils for a really long time. Like, there's prehistoric utensils. And we've also been eating meat for a really long time, 20, more than 20, probably a few 100,000 years. And I don't mean like we've had a predominantly meat diet. And so people now are born without wisdom teeth, even though every single person used to have them, or pretty much. Now, because you have four, you have two on the right side and two on the left, one on top, one on bottom. So you got four in all. And now 20 to 25% of people are born with 1 to 3. So they might only have one, they might have 3 of them. 35% of people are born with none at all, because we don't need wisdom teeth. And in fact, they can make it so you have a lot more cavities, which means that you could have a lot more bacteria and stuff in your mouth, because it's really hard to reach them when you're brushing your teeth. So now wisdom teeth are actually a detriment. And so 35% of people don't have them. And as we've been keeping track of this, it's become more and more common to not have wisdom teeth, to be born with none, or be born with fewer. And so again, this is just an example of how evolution is always happening. We're not changing as a whole species. We're not, by the biological or the ecological species definition, we're not different species. But our species is changing within the species because we don't have wisdom teeth anymore. And so that's just an example of evolution occurring. And like I said, it's occurring all the time. And it's going to continue to occur for, as long as the earth survives, pretty much.